November 28, 1941, Imperial Army Headquarters, Tokyo. Lieutenant General Masahiro Takeda couldn't contain his satisfaction as he placed the final document on the conference table, a detailed analysis of Dutch East Indies oil production capacity. The morning sun streaming through the headquarters windows illuminated maps showing Japan's strategic dilemma and its seemingly perfect solution. 65 million barrels of annual production waiting in Sumatra, Borneo, and Java, enough to fuel the entire imperial war machine indefinitely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Gentlemen, our oil crisis ends in Balikpapan and Palembang, Takeda announced to the assembled staff officers, his finger tracing the locations of the richest oil fields in Southeast Asia. American embargoes cannot strangle an empire that controls the Dutch East Indies. Within 6 months of operations commencing, we will have secured sufficient petroleum reserves to sustain operations for a decade. What Takeda didn't know, what none of the confident officers nodding in agreement around that polished table could have possibly comprehended, was that they were planning to fight a war against a nation that produced more oil in a single week than all of Southeast Asia produced in a year. While Japanese strategists calculated capturing 65 million barrels annually from conquered territories, American oil fields were already producing 1.4 billion barrels annually, and that number would only grow. The mathematics were so lopsided, the disparity so enormous that Japanese officers would later admit that they had invaded a poker game with yen while America played with dollars by the truckload. But in November 1941, as Takeda closed his briefing folder with confident finality, the Imperial Command had no idea they were about to challenge an oil colossus so vast it would literally run their military dry while barely noticing the effort. The road to Japan's fatal miscalculation began on July 26, 1941, when President Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the United States, effectively cutting off 88% of Japan's oil imports. For a nation that produced only 7 million barrels annually while consuming 50 million, the embargo was an existential threat. Admiral Hideaki Yoshimura, chief of the Combined Fleet Fuel Division, delivered his assessment to the Naval General Staff in August 1941 with the precision of a man who understood that oil was more valuable than bullets. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Our strategic petroleum reserve stands at 43 million barrels, Yoshimura reported, adjusting the charts showing tanker routes now closed by American sanctions. At current consumption rates, which will increase dramatically during wartime operations, we have sufficient fuel for 18 months of intensive operations. After that, the combined fleet becomes an expensive collection of immobile steel. The room fell silent. Every officer understood what this meant. Japan could not sustain a prolonged war without securing alternative oil sources. The only significant petroleum reserves within striking distance lay in the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, and Burma. Colonel Takeshi Nakamura, Chief of Army Logistics, presented the solution that seemed so logical, so achievable. The Dutch East Indies produces 65 million barrels annually from fields at Tarakan, Balikpapan, Palembang, and Miri. Royal Dutch Shell operates these facilities with approximately 3,000 technical personnel. Intelligence suggests minimal military defense. We can secure these fields within 90 days of operations commencing, restore production within 6 months, and achieve energy independence. What made this assessment seem reasonable was Japan's understanding of oil production in 1941. The largest oil fields they knew about, Baku in the Soviet Union, the Romanian fields at Ploiești, produced tens of millions of barrels annually. The Dutch East Indies fields, producing 65 million barrels, seemed like a prize sufficient to fuel an empire. No one in that room had comprehended the true scale of American petroleum production. They knew America produced oil. The Texas fields, California wells, Oklahoma reserves were mentioned in intelligence reports. But the numbers seemed impossibly inflated, surely the result of American propaganda or intelligence errors. American oil production estimates range from 800 million to 1.2 billion barrels annually, reported Commander Kenji Watanabe from Naval Intelligence, his tone skeptical. These figures seem greatly exaggerated. For context, this would mean America produces more oil than the rest of the world combined. Such capacity seems improbable given the technical limitations of extraction and refining. The officers nodded in agreement. Surely the Americans were inflating their numbers, as nations often did for strategic deception purposes. Lieutenant General Takeda synthesized the intelligence into what seemed like sound strategic reasoning. Even if American oil production approaches the higher estimates, the Pacific War will be decided before their industrial capacity becomes relevant. By securing the Dutch East Indies, we achieve energy self-sufficiency. American oil production, whatever its actual level, cannot project power across 5,000 miles of ocean. They can produce all the oil they wish. They cannot deliver it to the Pacific theater in sufficient quantities to matter. This logic that distance and logistics would neutralize American industrial advantages permeated Japanese strategic thinking. They were preparing to fight a war of conquest and defense, not comprehending they were about to enter an industrial endurance contest they had already lost. What Japanese intelligence failed to grasp wasn't just the quantity of American oil production, it was the nature of the industry itself. In November 1941, while Japanese officers studied maps of Sumatran oil fields, a different kind of meeting was taking place 8,000 miles away in Houston, Texas. James Morrison, chief engineer for Continental Petroleum, stood before a gathering of oil executives and government officials presenting production projections that would have seemed like fantasy to Japanese planners. Current production stands at 3.8 million barrels daily, Morrison announced, pointing to a chart showing production curves climbing steadily upward. The Permian Basin in Texas can increase output by 40% within 6 months of receiving priority classification. The East Texas field alone produces more than Japan's total annual consumption. And we've barely begun exploiting reserves in Louisiana, Wyoming, and offshore California. Robert Chin, representing Standard Oil, added the refining capacity numbers that completed the picture. We're currently operating at 65% capacity. Our refineries can process 5 million barrels daily at full utilization. We're building 3 new cracking facilities that will add another 500,000 barrels daily of aviation fuel production by mid-1943. These weren't government officials speaking. These were private industry executives discussing production increases that exceeded Japan's total annual consumption as if discussing quarterly sales targets. The American oil industry wasn't mobilizing through war. It was slightly increasing peacetime production. The scale was incomprehensible by Japanese standards. A single American oil field, the East Texas field discovered in 1930, produced 500,000 barrels daily at its peak. That one field produced more in a month than Japan's entire annual domestic production, and it was just one of hundreds of major American oil fields. Martha Rodriguez had worked as a secretary in Oklahoma City until September 1941. By December, she was training as a derrick operator in the Glenpool oil field, learning to manage equipment that could drill 5,000 feet in weeks, depths that would have taken Japanese equipment months to achieve if they could reach them at all. They told us we were producing fuel for the war effort, Martha recalled in a 1988 interview. But honestly, it didn't feel like we changed much. We just worked more shifts. The wells were already there, the equipment was already running, we just ran it harder. One supervisor told me our single field produced more oil in a week than Japan's entire country produced in a year. I thought he was exaggerating. He wasn't. The Japanese offensive that began on December 7, 1941, achieved its initial objectives with stunning success. By January 24, 1942, Japanese forces had secured Balikpapan, one of the richest oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. Commander Hiroshi Yamada, assigned to the Navy's Petroleum Acquisition Unit, arrived at Balikpapan on January 28, 1942, expecting to find the key to Japan's energy independence. What he found instead was the first hint of the disaster to come. The Dutch, retreating before Japanese forces, had demolished the refineries with systematic thoroughness. Storage tanks burned, cracking towers lay in ruins, pumping stations were sabotaged beyond quick repair. Yamada stood in the wreckage and calculated. 6 months to restore basic production, perhaps a year to reach pre-war capacity. "Send to headquarters," Yamada instructed his communications officer. "Balikpapan field secured but heavily damaged. Estimated production restoration timeline, minimum 6 months for initial output, 12 months for 50% capacity. We will need specialized equipment, technical personnel, and substantial reconstruction resources." But the shock wasn't just the sabotage, it was realizing the scale of what they'd captured. Once production was restored, Balikpapan at full capacity would produce approximately 8 million barrels annually. For this prize, Japan had committed substantial naval and air resources, occupied territory requiring ongoing military presence, and would need to invest months of reconstruction effort. 8 million barrels annually. The East Texas field in America produced that much in 16 days. The moment Japanese confidence began its fatal erosion came in March 1942, when intelligence officer Lieutenant Commander Kenji Watanabe received a captured American document that he initially assumed was propaganda. The document, a Standard Oil annual report from 1940, contained production statistics that Watanabe read 3 times, certain there was a translation error. He called for his superior, Captain Takeshi Morimoto. "Sir, this document claims American oil production in 1940 was 1.35 billion barrels," Watanabe said, his voice uncertain. "This must be an error. Perhaps they mean million, not billion." Morimoto studied the document carefully. It was clearly authentic, a corporate report to shareholders, not propaganda material. The production figures were broken down by region, by company, by field. The mathematics were consistent throughout. "If this is accurate," Morimoto said slowly, "then American daily production exceeds our annual production by a factor of 70. That would mean a single American oil field produces more in days than we produce in a year." They brought the document to Admiral Yoshimura, whose reaction evolved from skepticism to horrified realization as he worked through the numbers. "This cannot be correct," Yoshimura insisted. "No nation can produce petroleum at such levels. The technical requirements alone, the drilling capacity, the refining infrastructure, the transportation network would require an industrial base beyond anything we've ever encountered." But as more captured documents arrived, technical journals, trade publications, government reports, the picture became undeniable. America didn't just produce more oil than Japan. America produced more oil than Japan, Germany, Italy, and all the conquered territories combined, multiplied by 10. Yoshimura's report to the Naval General Staff in April 1942 marked the moment Japanese strategic assumptions began collapsing. Intelligence now confirms American petroleum production capacity exceeds 1.3 billion barrels annually. This is not propaganda. This appears to be accurate based on multiple independent sources. The strategic implications are severe. Even with complete success in securing Dutch East Indies production, estimated maximum 65 million barrels annually after reconstruction, we will control approximately 5% of American production capacity. They can lose tankers, suffer attacks on refineries, and experience supply disruptions that would cripple our operations, yet barely notice the impact on their overall supply. By June 1942, Japan had secured most of the Southeast Asian oil fields it had coveted. Palembang, Tarakan, Miri, Balikpapan, and smaller fields throughout the region. Reconstruction efforts were underway, with Japanese engineers working frantically to restore production. The captured territories, even at pre-war production levels, would produce approximately 65 million barrels annually, exactly what Japanese planners had calculated.
But the consumption rates were already revealing the fatal flaw in Japanese planning. Colonel Nakamura, reviewing fuel consumption reports from the first 6 months of operations, delivered devastating news to the Army General Staff in July 1942. The Southern operations consumed 18 million barrels of fuel oil, 40% of our strategic reserve. The combined fleet consumed an additional 12 million barrels. In 6 months of warfare, we have consumed 30 million barrels while producing only 3 million barrels domestically. The Dutch East Indies fields, even when fully restored, will not cover current consumption rates. The numbers were merciless. Japan's military consumed 80 million barrels annually during active operations. Domestic production and captured fields might eventually provide 72 million barrels annually. They were consuming fuel faster than they could produce it, even with the conquered territories operating at full capacity. And that assumed the captured fields could be restored to full production, an assumption that grew more doubtful with each passing month. Lieutenant Commander Yoshiro Tanaka, assigned to oversee petroleum logistics, identified the critical bottleneck in August 1942. The primary constraint is not production capacity at the fields, it is refining capacity and transportation. The Dutch East Indies produced crude oil, but most refining occurred in facilities we've destroyed or that were sabotaged. We need to build refining capacity from scratch while simultaneously defending these facilities from enemy attack. Additionally, we need tankers to transport crude and refined products, but our tanker fleet is being systematically targeted by American submarines. This last point was becoming critical. Japan began the war with 49 large tankers, totaling 587,000 tons capacity. By August 1942, 6 had been sunk by American submarines. Each lost tanker meant less fuel reaching the home islands, regardless of how much oil the captured fields produced.
The moment that would haunt Japanese strategic planning occurred in September 1942 during a fuel allocation conference at Imperial Headquarters. Admiral Yoshimura, now acutely aware of the petroleum crisis, presented allocation requests that totaled 95 million barrels for the following 12 months. The combined fleet needed 45 million barrels. The Army needed 35 million barrels. Aviation required 15 million barrels. The merchant marine and civilian economy needed minimal allocations to function. Lieutenant General Takeda, confronting the mathematics, realized the empire faced an impossible equation. We are requesting 95 million barrels. Our optimistic production projections, assuming successful field restoration and no major tanker losses, suggest we will produce 70 million barrels in the next year. We are planning to consume oil we do not have and cannot produce. The room fell into uncomfortable silence. Every officer understood what this meant. Someone would not receive their fuel allocation. Operations would be canceled. Training would be curtailed. The Navy and Army would compete for insufficient resources. Commander Watanabe, who had first identified the scale of American production, spoke the truth everyone was avoiding. Gentlemen, we are debating how to allocate 70 million barrels, while America produces 1,400 million barrels annually. They produce in 18 days what we will produce in a year. This is not a petroleum shortage, this is petroleum bankruptcy. Captain Morimoto added the devastating context. American forces in the Pacific are not fuel-constrained. They operate ships, aircraft, and vehicles continuously without apparent concern for consumption. Their submarines patrol for weeks, their carriers launch unlimited sorties. They can afford to be wasteful because they are drawing from effectively unlimited reserves. We must carefully allocate every barrel because we are drawing from a rapidly depleting account. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese strategic planning had been based on capturing oil fields to achieve energy independence. They had succeeded in capturing the fields, yet
they were more fuel-constrained than before the war began because consumption had exploded while production barely increased.
By December 1942, most of the major Dutch East Indies oil fields were back in limited production. Japanese petroleum engineers had performed near miracles, restoring bombed facilities under combat conditions with limited equipment. Commander Yamada, touring the restored Balikpapan facilities, sent a report to headquarters that captured both their achievement and its inadequacy. Balikpapan currently producing 22,000 barrels daily, approximately 75% of pre-war capacity. This represents significant success given the destruction we inherited. However, strategic impact remains minimal. This field's annual production, at full capacity, equals approximately 5 days of American production from the Permian Basin alone. We have secured an anthill while they possess a mountain. The comparison wasn't even fair. It was mathematically absurd. The Permian Basin in Texas, a single geological formation, contained thousands of individual wells producing from multiple oil-bearing layers. Daily production from this one region exceeded Japan's entire captured oil empire. But the American advantage wasn't just quantity, it was quality and efficiency. American refineries, using catalytic cracking technology developed in the 1930s, could produce 60% gasoline from crude oil. Japanese refineries, using older thermal cracking methods, produced 30% gasoline. This meant America extracted twice as much usable fuel from each barrel of crude. Additionally, American aviation gasoline used higher octane ratings, 87 to 100 octane, compared to Japan's 87 octane standard. Higher octane meant more power from aircraft engines, giving American planes performance advantages beyond just airframe design. Even the transportation infrastructure favored America. A single pipeline from Texas to the East Coast, the Big Inch Pipeline, completed in 1943, could transport 300,000 barrels daily. Japan relied on tankers that were increasingly becoming steel coffins as American submarines prowled the shipping lanes.
The final element that transformed Japan's petroleum problem from severe to catastrophic was the systematic destruction of their tanker fleet by American submarines. In January 1943, Lieutenant Commander Tanaka delivered a logistics assessment that marked the beginning of the end. Tanker losses in 1942 totaled 22 vessels, representing 35% of our large tanker capacity. Replacement construction is insufficient to offset losses. Even if captured oil fields operate at full capacity, we lack sufficient tankers to transport the fuel to where it's needed. We are simultaneously facing production constraints and transportation constraints. The mathematics were brutal. Japan needed to transport approximately 60 million barrels annually from the Dutch East Indies to the home islands, a distance of 2,500 miles through increasingly hostile waters. Each tanker could make perhaps 6 round trips annually if unmolested. But American submarines were sinking tankers faster than Japan could build them. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, commanding the tanker Kokuyo Maru, on a fuel run from Balikpapan to Yokohama in February 1943, kept a diary that survived the war. Every voyage is terror. The Americans are everywhere. We travel in convoy with escorts, yet they still find us. Yesterday, the Tatsuya Maru was hit by 2 torpedoes and went down with 12,000 barrels of crude. We couldn't stop to rescue survivors. The water burned with oil. This is our 3rd voyage. I don't expect to survive a 4th. Nakamura's pessimism was warranted. The Kokuyo Maru was sunk by USS Tautog on March 11, 1943, with all hands lost. The tanker war was a massacre. American submarines, operating with increasing effectiveness as their torpedo problems were resolved, targeted oil transport as a strategic priority. In 1943 alone, American submarines sank 107 Japanese tankers, totaling over 800,000 tons of shipping.
By mid-1943, Japan had lost over 60% of its tanker fleet. The oil fields in Sumatra and Borneo could produce crude, but it sat in storage tanks because there weren't enough tankers to transport the oil to where it was needed. The petroleum empire Japan had fought to acquire was becoming useless because they couldn't move the oil to where it was needed. Admiral Yoshimura's June 1943 assessment marked the point where strategic denial became impossible. Our petroleum situation is terminal. Production in occupied territories has reached approximately 50 million barrels annually, but only 30 million barrels is reaching the home islands due to tanker losses. Consumption remains at 75 million barrels annually. We are consuming our strategic reserves at a rate that will result in complete depletion by mid-1944. At that point, the combined fleet will be unable to conduct major operations due to fuel constraints. The officers receiving this report understood what it meant. Japan had less than a year before fuel shortages would force the military into strategic paralysis. They were losing the war because they were running out of gas. And across the Pacific, American oil wells continued pumping, American refineries continued processing, and American tankers, building faster than submarines could sink them, continued delivering fuel in quantities that made Japanese constraints seem like rationing raindrops while standing beside an ocean.
January 1944. Commander Yoshiro Tanaka stood in the fuel allocation office at Yokosuka Naval Base, staring at requisition forms that represented an impossible mathematics problem. The combined fleet was requesting 3.2 million barrels for the month. Available allocation, 1.4 million barrels. Which ships do we fuel? His deputy, Lieutenant Kenji Yamamoto, asked quietly. Which operations do we cancel? Tanaka made a decision that would be repeated at every Japanese naval base that month. Priority to operational carriers and their escorts. Everything else remains in port unless absolutely necessary. This was the new reality of Japanese naval warfare in 1944. Not tactical decisions about where to deploy forces, but brutal triage about which ships could afford to move at all. The mighty Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, sat at anchor consuming precious fuel just to maintain basic systems because there wasn't enough fuel to deploy her except for critical operations. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, executive officer aboard the carrier Shokaku, recorded in his log the practical impact of fuel rationing. Training flights canceled. Our new pilots receive 40 hours of flight time before carrier qualification, barely enough to land safely, much less engage in combat. American pilots reach the fleet with 400 hours, but we lack fuel for training. We are sending boys with minimal experience against veterans because we cannot afford the fuel to train them properly. The fuel crisis was creating a catastrophic cascade throughout Japanese military operations. Insufficient fuel meant reduced training. Reduced training meant higher combat losses. Higher losses meant more replacement pilots needed. But there wasn't fuel to train replacements adequately, perpetuating the death spiral. By March 1944, the Japanese Army was experiencing similar constraints. Mechanized divisions sat immobile. Aircraft remained grounded. Even basic transportation became a critical concern as gasoline allocations dwindled. Colonel Takeshi Nakamura, now commanding the 14th Tank Regiment in the Philippines, received his March fuel allocation and realized his regiment was effectively neutralized. Allocated fuel sufficient for 200 kilometers of operation. My area of responsibility covers 1,500 kilometers. We cannot train. We cannot patrol. We can barely reposition if attacked. We have become a static defense force, not by tactical choice, but by petroleum bankruptcy.
While Japan rationed fuel by the barrel, America's production was reaching levels that defied comprehension. In February 1944, James Morrison stood before a gathering at the Petroleum Administration for War in Washington, presenting production figures that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Current production stands at 4.7 million barrels daily, Morrison announced, pointing to charts showing steadily climbing output. We've increased production by 35% since 1941, while simultaneously building strategic reserves. The East Texas field alone is producing 450,000 barrels daily. New fields in Louisiana and Wyoming are adding another 300,000 barrels daily. We're not straining capacity, we're operating comfortably within our sustainable production envelope. Robert Chen from Standard Oil added the refining numbers that completed the picture of American petroleum dominance. Our catalytic cracking capacity has tripled since 1941. We're producing 100-octane aviation fuel at rates that exceed total Japanese fuel consumption. The new refineries in Louisiana can process 800,000 barrels daily of crude into finished products. We're building 3 more facilities that will add another 1 million barrels daily of capacity by 1945. These weren't emergency measures or unsustainable surge production. This was American industry operating at what it considered normal wartime efficiency. The petroleum sector hadn't even been fully mobilized. There were still untapped reserves, unused capacity, wells that could be drilled if needed. Martha Rodriguez, now a field supervisor at Glen Pool, watched new wells being drilled with equipment that could reach depths and production rates Japanese engineers would have considered science fiction. We brought in a well in March that produced 2,000 barrels daily from its first week. That one well produced more in a month than some entire Japanese oil fields. And we were drilling dozens of these wells every month across Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana. It wasn't even considered remarkable. The scale was so enormous that American forces in the Pacific operated without meaningful fuel constraints. Ships refueled at sea from dedicated tankers. Aircraft flew training missions, consuming fuel that would have been considered wasteful luxury by Japanese standards. Vehicles operated continuously without concerns about rationing. Lieutenant Commander Michael Harrison, commanding a destroyer escort in the Pacific, noted something that would have driven Japanese officers to despair. Refueled at sea from USS Platte, 15,000 gallons in 90 minutes. The tanker reported it was her 3rd refueling operation today. She's carrying 150,000 barrels and will refuel the task force multiple times before returning to Pearl Harbor for resupply. The fuel officer mentioned they're actually having trouble using fuel fast enough and might need to reduce tanker runs. Meanwhile, we're running continuous patrols at 20 knots, a speed Japanese destroyers can barely maintain due to fuel constraints.
The moment when fuel constraints transformed from operational hindrance to strategic paralysis came in June 1944, during what would become known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the mobile fleet, assembled Japan's remaining carrier strength for what he knew would be a decisive engagement: 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, supported by battleships and cruisers. But his planning was constrained not by tactics or intelligence, but by fuel. Admiral Hideaki Yoshimura, now serving as Ozawa's logistics officer, delivered the assessment that would determine Japanese options. Available fuel allocation allows for a one-way transit to the Philippine Sea, combat operations for approximately 36 hours, and return to base with minimal reserves. We cannot conduct extended operations. We cannot maneuver freely. We must engage decisively and withdraw quickly, or we will lack fuel to return. The American task force facing Ozawa operated under no such constraints. Vice Admiral Mark Mitzter commanded 15 carriers supported by 7 battleships and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. His fuel officer reported tanks at 85% capacity, with 2 fleet oilers standing by for underway replenishment.
The American force could operate for weeks without refueling, maneuvering freely, launching continuous strikes. What followed was less a battle than a demonstration of what unlimited fuel meant in naval warfare. American carriers launched wave after wave of strikes. When aircraft returned low on fuel, they landed, refueled, and launched again. The Japanese could not match this operational tempo because they lacked the fuel for continuous flight operations. Commander Kenji Watanabe, serving aboard the carrier Zuikaku, witnessed the fuel crisis's combat impact firsthand. "We launched our strike aircraft knowing we lacked sufficient fuel for a second strike. The Americans launched continuously. When our fighters ran low on fuel, they had to land or ditch. American fighters could remain airborne for hours because they had tankers nearby for immediate refueling if needed. We weren't defeated by better tactics. We were defeated by better logistics. They had fuel. We didn't." Facing terminal petroleum shortages, Japan attempted to develop synthetic fuel production from coal, similar to Germany's efforts. The program, initiated in 1943, revealed another dimension of American industrial superiority. By 1944, Japan's synthetic fuel plants were producing approximately 200,000 barrels annually, achievement requiring massive industrial investment that nonetheless equaled less than 1 day of American natural petroleum production. Engineer Takashi Suzuki, overseeing the Ube synthetic fuel facility, captured the futility in his technical report. "Our plant, representing 2 years of construction and employing 3,000 workers, produces 600 barrels daily when operating at full capacity." This required Japan's full synthetic fuel production capability. Meanwhile, a medium-sized American oil field produces this amount from a single well in under an hour. We are applying extraordinary effort to achieve what America considers trivial production. The synthetic fuel program consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere: steel, skilled workers, industrial capacity, to produce fuel quantities so small they barely registered against Japan's consumption. It was the industrial equivalent of using a teaspoon to bail out a sinking ship. The final accounting of petroleum production told a story of industrial disparity so extreme it seemed almost fictional. American petroleum production, 1941 to 1945. 1941, 1,402 million barrels. 1942, 1,386 million barrels. 1943, 1,505 million barrels. 1944, 1,677 million barrels. 1945, 1,714 million barrels. Total, 7,684 million barrels. Japanese petroleum production, 1941 to 1945, including domestic production and captured Dutch East Indies fields at maximum restored capacity. 1941, 7 million barrels, domestic only. 1942, 15 million barrels, limited captured field production. 1943, 42 million barrels, captured fields partially restored. 1944, 38 million barrels, production declining due to damage. 1945, 12 million barrels, most facilities destroyed. Total, 114 million barrels. The ratio? America produced 67 barrels for every barrel Japan produced during the war. But even these staggering numbers understated American dominance. The United States simultaneously built 2,710 Liberty ships and hundreds of tankers to transport fuel, developed 100-octane aviation fuel, giving aircraft performance advantages, created pipeline infrastructure, moving 300,000 barrels daily overland, maintained strategic petroleum reserves exceeding Japan's total wartime production, supplied Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies with fuel while fighting in 2 theaters. The petroleum engineer James Morrison, reflecting in 1952 on America's wartime oil production, captured the scale in memorable terms. Japan fought the war to secure the Dutch East Indies oil fields, producing 65 million barrels annually. In 1944, the East Texas field alone produced 150 million barrels. One field in Texas produced more than twice what Japan fought the entire war to capture. We had dozens of such fields. They never had a chance. In 1958, former Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was interviewed for a Japanese military history project. When asked about the Philippine Sea battle, he returned immediately to fuel. Mitzer commanded 15 carriers. I commanded 9. The numbers suggest relative parity, a 5-3 disadvantage that good tactics might overcome. But the real disparity was fuel. Mitzer could operate his carriers continuously for weeks without refueling concerns. I had fuel for 36 hours of combat operations before needing to withdraw. When your opponent can launch unlimited strikes because he has unlimited fuel, tactics become irrelevant. When your fighters must return to carriers after 90 minutes because you lack fuel reserves, while enemy fighters can remain airborne for hours, training becomes less important than endurance. We didn't lose at PO Philippine Sea because of tactical mistakes. We lost because we ran out of fuel while fighting an enemy with infinite petroleum reserves. That's not a battle. It's industrial slaughter. Lieutenant General Masahiro Takeda, reflecting on Japan's strategic decisions in his 1960 memoir, provided the final eulogy for Japan's petroleum strategy. We laughed in November 1941 at suggestions that American oil production would determine the war's outcome. We believed industrial capacity was irrelevant to military operations, that tactical brilliance, warrior spirit, and strategic surprise would overcome material disadvantages. By 1944, our carriers sat in port because we lacked fuel to deploy them. Our aircraft remained grounded because we lacked fuel for training or operations. Our tanks were immobile, our trucks stationary, our strategic choices constrained not by enemy action, but by empty fuel tanks. The Americans built an empire on oil. We tried to fight them with captured oil fields producing what they pumped in weeks. They didn't just have more oil, they had so much oil they could afford to be wasteful. They trained pilots we couldn't afford to train. They operated fleets we couldn't afford to fuel. They fought a war of unlimited mobility while we fought a war of petroleum poverty. We entered the war believing we could secure energy independence through conquest. We succeeded in capturing the oil fields we sought, yet we still lost the petroleum war because we never understood the scale of what we were fighting against. You cannot defeat an opponent producing 1,700 million barrels annually when you struggle to produce 40 million. The war wasn't decided at Midway or Guadalcanal. It was decided in Texas oil fields, Oklahoma wells, and Louisiana refineries that produced more petroleum in a month than our entire empire produced in a year. We challenged a petroleum superpower to a fuel consumption contest. The outcome was inevitable from the first barrel pumped. The Empire of Japan learned, at the cost of its existence, that modern industrial warfare is fundamentally about resources. Tactics matter, training matters, leadership matters. But when one side has essentially unlimited fuel and the other is rationing every gallon, the outcome is predetermined. They fought for oil fields and lost the war in refineries they never bombed, wells they never knew existed, and tankers that kept sailing no matter how many were sunk. Japan ran out of fuel while America was still deciding what to do with its surplus. That wasn't military defeat. That was petroleum bankruptcy against an opponent who owned the bank.
In 1950,
Admiral Hideaki Yoshimura published his memoirs, providing the most complete analysis of Japan's petroleum failure. His chapter on fuel logistics was titled "The War We Lost Before It Started." I calculated in August 1941 that Japan needed to capture and control petroleum production of at least 80 million barrels annually to sustain wartime operations, Yoshimura wrote. We succeeded in capturing fields capable of producing 65 million barrels annually. But three factors destroyed this strategy. First, production restoration took far longer than projected. Fields we expected to restore in 6 months took 2 years. By then, the strategic situation had deteriorated. Second, tanker losses exceeded worst-case projections. We began the war with 49 large tankers. By war's end, we had lost 87% of our tanker fleet. Oil sitting in Sumatran storage tanks was strategically worthless if we couldn't transport it to Japan. Third, and most fatally, we completely misunderstood the scale of American production. Intelligence reports suggesting America produced 1,400 million barrels annually seemed so impossible that we dismissed them as propaganda. They were conservative estimates. Actual production exceeded 1,700 million barrels in 1944. We were fighting for control of oil fields, producing 65 million barrels, while America produced 1,700 million barrels. We committed our military, our economy, our national survival to securing petroleum resources that represented less than 4% of our opponent's production. The Americans didn't defeat us through superior tactics or braver soldiers. They buried us under an oil flood so vast that our captured fields were irrelevant. They could afford to train pilots for 400 hours because fuel was abundant. We sent pilots with 40 hours because fuel was precious. They operated fleets continuously because tankers delivered unlimited fuel. We rationed every barrel because our tankers were being sunk faster than we could replace them. We lost the Petroleum War in December 1941. We just didn't realize it until 1944 when our tanks sat immobile, our aircraft remained grounded, and our ships stayed in port because we had run out of fuel.
The ultimate demonstration of how completely fuel shortages had paralyzed Japanese naval power came in April 1945 during the Yamato's final sortie. The mission, Operation Tengo, called for the battleship Yamato, the light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers to attack American forces off Okinawa. But the mission planning was dominated not by tactical considerations, but by fuel availability. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, now serving as operations officer for the 2nd Fleet, recorded the impossible logistics. Yamato requires 6,000 tons of fuel oil for the mission. Available fuel allocation, 2,500 tons. Admiral Ito has been informed this is sufficient for a one-way mission only. There is no fuel for return. The largest battleship ever built is being sent on a suicide mission, partly because we lack the fuel to bring her home. The symbolism was devastating. Japan's mightiest warship, representing the pinnacle of naval construction, reduced to a one-way kamikaze mission because the Empire couldn't afford to fuel a round trip. American forces detected Yamato's approach and launched 386 aircraft from multiple carriers. The attacks sank Yamato, Yahagi, and 4 destroyers in less than 2 hours. American aircraft returned to their carriers, refueled, and were ready for additional strikes the same day. The Americans had fuel for hundreds of sorties. The Japanese had barely enough fuel for the ships to reach the combat zone. In September 1945, American petroleum engineers toured captured Japanese oil facilities. Their reports revealed the impossible position Japan had faced throughout the war. The Palembang refinery complex in Sumatra, captured by Japan in February 1942 and considered their prize petroleum facility, could process 15,000 barrels daily at peak capacity. A medium-sized American refinery processed 50,000 barrels daily. The entire Dutch East Indies petroleum infrastructure that Japan fought to capture could produce, at absolute maximum capacity, approximately 65 million barrels annually. Texas alone produced 750 million barrels annually. In 1947, Lieutenant General Takeda testified before the International Military Tribunal explaining Japanese strategic calculations. His statement captured the fatal miscalculation. We calculated that seizing the Dutch East Indies oil fields would solve our petroleum crisis. The mathematics seemed sound. 65 million barrels annually would exceed our peacetime consumption of 50 million barrels. What we failed to understand was that wartime consumption would increase by 60%, that production restoration would take longer than expected, that tanker losses would prevent delivery of captured oil, and most critically, that we were competing against an opponent producing 1,500 million barrels annually. We brought arithmetic to a calculus problem. We planned for a petroleum war against an opponent with 20 times our production capacity. Every strategic decision we made was constrained by fuel shortages while America operated without meaningful constraints. I approved the attack on Pearl Harbor, believing we could achieve energy independence through conquest. By 1944, our captured oil fields were producing at near maximum capacity, yet we were more fuel-starved than in 1941 because consumption had exploded. We literally ran out of fuel while sitting on top of captured oil fields. That is not a tactical failure, it is a strategic impossibility.